When life doesn't so much give you lemons as hurl them at you from a great height, with the intent of inflicting significant damage on you, it's sometimes a moment for big change. You can't carry on doing what you've done before. It's going to force you to jump the tracks, find ways around the problem, reframe the world. Now, innovation history is full of examples. Take the case of Django Reinhardt, a successful musician in the 1920s whose career was nearly brought to a sudden end in 1928 when his caravan caught fire, leaving him with life-threatening burns over half of his body, including damaging 2 fingers of his left hand, with all that implied for his ever being able to play guitar again. His response was to evolve a completely new style, using his remaining fingers, and in the process creating the distinctive approach which made his name as one of the founders of gypsy jazz. The pianist Keith Jarrett had a similar challenge to his ability to play, though fortunately less physically direct. Contracted to give a late-night concert in Cologne's Opera House, he arrived to find a mix-up meant that the piano on which he was to play was an out-of-tune and malfunctioning rehearsal machine. With some frantic and unfinished attempts by a tuner to bring it into line, Jarrett embarked on a journey of improvisation, adapting to the limitations of the instrument to create what has become a legendary and thankfully recorded performance. In the world of healthcare, there's a website, Patient Innovation, which reminds us of just how powerful this effect can be. It lists thousands of innovations which patients and their carers have developed as ways of finding a solution to their problem, getting round, reframing the challenges that are facing them. Now, this isn't a new phenomenon. One of history's great innovators was arguably pushed to reframe his world and think differently about it as the result of what he termed later a happy accident. Now, that's not quite the description most of us might use to capture falling ill with smallpox and losing the use of a leg, which eventually has to be amputated. But that's where the huge innovation legacy of Josiah Wedgwood began. Born in 1730 in Burslem in Staffordshire, clay, or at least traces of it, was in his blood. He and his relatives had been turning pots for 4 generations, and he'd learned the trade the hard way. Whatever needed doing, putting his shoulder to the big wheel with the horses that drove the smaller potter's wheel on which those shapes were formed, stacking for firing and unloading from the kiln, fetching, carrying, packing and shipping, all the jobs. But his career as a master potter was sadly cut short by an attack of smallpox when he was 11 years old, which weakened his knee to the point where he couldn't work the potter's kick wheel on which the trade rather depended. Formerly apprenticed to his older brother, his bad leg meant that he was unable to perform such laborious tasks as throwing pottery clay. Instead, he began to spend much of his enforced sitting time reading and experimenting, trying out new ideas and recipes, and painstakingly recording the results in his notebooks. It forced him to look at the whole process from a different angle, and reframing it threw up powerful and valuable insights, because pottery was about to become big business. From a pretty early date, we've made use of clay to make functional utensils like plates and cups. In fact, relics found in Jianren province in China are close to 20,000 years old. But ceramics have also been a long-standing part of history as a visual pleasure, formed and decorated in exquisite ways using complex materials and techniques. The trouble was that only the very wealthy could afford the workmanship and materials needed to create the fine porcelain that was so prized in the early 18th century. But things were changing. In particular, the rise of the middle classes and their growing wealth had begun opening up a huge potential market for functional but beautiful tableware. And England was well placed to respond to this demand, as potteries like Minton and Spode had begun to demonstrate with their porcelain wares, made from the finest Cornish china clay. The future would belong to the innovators, of whom Josiah Wedgwood's brother was certainly not one. In 1749, his apprenticeship ended. The family fortunes had improved somewhat, thanks to his ideas, but his brother wasn't convinced of the value of innovation and refused to take Josiah in as a partner. So he left the family business and in 1752 formed a partnership with John Harrison of clockmaking fame and Thomas Alders. This was, however, a short-lived association, as Wedgwood and Harrison clashed over manufacturing ideas. In a sense, Josiah had moved from a world where there was too little innovation to one where there was too much innovation under the same roof. His next move in 1754 was more productive, a meeting of minds, since his new partner, Thomas Wealden, was a successful potter who also loved to experiment. Wealden was interested in Josiah's approach, not least because there was an urgent need to improve the quality of his lead-glazed creamware while keeping costs competitive. As Wedgwood noted, these considerations induced me to try for some more solid improvement, as well in the body as the glazes, the colours, and the forms of the articles of our manufacture. He started keeping his experiment book at this time, containing details of his work and carefully listing measurements, ingredients, using a coded system that only he could understand. Over the next years, it swelled to contain the details of thousands of experiments, many of them failures, but crucially providing a roadmap for future innovation directions. After 5 years, Josiah parted company from Wealden to set up on his own. He leased the Ivy House Pottery back in Burslem from one of his uncles. The business grew so well that he was able to open a second works in the town. But in 1762, returning trouble with his leg forced him to spend several weeks in bed. As it turned out, another candidate for that happy accident status, because it was while he was bedbound in the city of Liverpool that a friend introduced him to Thomas Bentley, who would eventually become his business partner. Now, innovation's rarely a solo act. In most cases, it's the convergence of different skills, experience, and insight which can help to build something new. Think of Hewlett and Packard, Jobs and Wozniak, Gates and Allen, and it was certainly true of Wedgwood and Bentley. Bentley brought a deep understanding of the trading side of the pottery business, together with a classical education and a rich network of contacts to the party. He understood the ways in which ceramic fashions were changing and how the technical skills of Wedgwood could help play in such a market. Over the next years, they not only made a wide range of tableware, but also specialty wares for retailers, dairies, sanitary suppliers, including tiles for indoor bathrooms, as well as the sewers that were being built all over England, and various other applications in the home. But beyond the functional, Bentley also saw a growing demand for artifacts inspired by the classical Greek, Roman, and Etruscan styles. And the company began making cameos, vases, jugs, and plaques decorated with such themes. Just like the Meissen Company in Germany had begun to work with artists and designers, so Wedgwood and Bentley began to draw on Bentley's contacts to supply the artwork and give a distinctive style to their products. Josiah Wedgwood didn't like porcelain, or rather, he did from an aesthetic point of view. Its white purity, translucent thin strength, the wonderful shapes it could be fashioned into, all of these triggered his potter's admiration as the high point of the craft. No, his objection to porcelain was entirely economic. This was a time when the big prize wasn't selling expensive ceramics to wealthy aristocrats, but somehow giving the same experience of fine pottery plates, cups, saucers, pots and jugs, giving that to the growing middle class. The Industrial Revolution was changing the economic as well as the social structure of Britain. There was now this potential mass market and an appetite for new goods. All manufacturers like Wedgwood had to do was create good quality products to satisfy it. Well, he worked hard. He understood this and worked hard to bring to simpler earthenware and stoneware those distinctive features, fine designs, and the tactile quality normally associated with porcelain. Wedgwood's favourite motto was, "Everything yields to experiment." And so he continued the laboratory work, aiming to move pottery from a rude, uncultivated craft into a field of applied science. And it was through this process that he made his first major achievement, the invention of a green glaze, recorded after 6 months of unsuccessful trial and error as experiment number 7. It proved to be popular and helped establish their business's reputation for innovation, something which he followed up with in the development of a better form of creamware. Creamware is a cream-coloured earthenware, and it had become popular as an economic alternative to porcelain, but it had significant limitations. But through his experimental approach, Wedgwood transformed it into a high-quality ceramic that was really versatile. It could be thrown on a wheel, turned on a lathe, or cast. The company began receiving orders from the highest-ranking people, and in 1765 received an invitation from St. James's Palace, London, for a complete set of tea things with a gold ground and raised flowers upon it in green. That invitation came from Queen Charlotte, the wife of King George III, and it took the form of a competitive tender. Fortunately, Wedgwood's hard work in the laboratory paid off. He won the competition and the contract. More importantly, he'd been canny enough to include other samples of his wares in the delivery, and they attracted further interest. In fact, the Queen was so pleased that in 1766 she gave him what must rank as one of the first celebrity endorsements, issuing a royal warrant with the wording, "To this manufacturer the Queen is pleased to give her name and patronage, commanding it to be called Queensware, and honouring the inventor by appointing him Her Majesty's Potter." Wedgwood was nothing if not quick on the uptake, and soon that title, Potter to Her Majesty, was being added to invoices and orders, while Queensware featured prominently in newspaper advertisements for his products. As with the Meissen porcelain business in Germany, the importance of a brand identity became apparent. It hadn't been customary for Staffordshire potters to put their name or mark on their wares, but Josiah began stamping the base of his products as a mark of authenticity and quality. His marketing wasn't confined to influencers and advertising, though. He pioneered many innovative approaches to reaching and serving his growing market, including offering free delivery from his factory to London and free replacement of items broken in transit. He opened shops and showrooms in fashionable cities like Bath as well as in the capital. And he pioneered a two-tiered approach, selling first to the aristocracy at premium prices and then using the cachet which their adoption gave to promote sales at lower prices to aspirational middle-class buyers. In 1764, he'd received his first order from abroad, and he built on that success. By 1769, he declared his aim was to become vase maker general to the universe. Well, he might not have exported off planet, but he did a pretty good job in terrestrial terms. By 1784, he was exporting nearly 80% of his produce, and by 1790, he'd sold his wares in every city in Europe. Perhaps the project which best underlines his grasp of the competitive edge which a combination of technical competence, great design and sophisticated marketing skills can offer is the famous Frog Service Commission. This came from Empress Catherine the Great of Russia in 1773. And it called for a huge dinner and dessert service, 944 pieces, for use at the Chesme Palace near St. Petersburg. Now, this palace was located on marshy ground and had once been called La Grenouillerie because of the large local frog population. Catherine wanted to use this frog motif on every item of the service, and for that service to contain 1,222 topographically correct hand-painted views of British landscapes. Significantly, she also wanted it to be made not of traditional porcelain, but in Wedgwood's famous queensware. Wedgwood undertook this huge commission and delivered, even though it took over 30 artists and 2 years to complete. It was never going to be a commercial success. The cost of final delivery was £2,612, against a commission price of £2,290. In today's money, that's just over £500,000 and £439,000. Basically, a big loss. But that loss was more than made up for in the benefits that came from reputation and marketing. The service was first displayed in London before it was delivered, and it attracted huge crowds, powerfully demonstrating that Wedgwood's earthenware and stoneware could rival the best porcelain in the world. And when that service in its 22 crates finally arrived in St. Petersburg in the autumn of 1774, it was displayed in the palace as a spectacle for visitors. Most of it has still survived and is now visible in the Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg. But Wedgwood wasn't only working on the marketing side. From his early days as an apprentice, he'd looked for ways to improve production operations, focusing not just on single problem areas, but looking at the manufacturing system as a whole. He was an early adopter of steam power, something which significantly reduced transportation costs, since it meant that the mills for grinding and preparing materials for the manufacturing process could now be located on the same site. It also mechanized the processes of throwing and turning pots, which had previously been driven by those foot or hand or horse-driven wheels. But it was less in his adoption of new machinery than in his approach to production organization that he had the biggest impact. He was fascinated by the ideas of Adam Smith around the concept of division of labor, focusing on specialization rather than having a single person carry out all the tasks in a series of operation. Mixing clay, throwing, firing and decorating, these were all separated into distinct operations and staffed by people trained in those areas, supported by specialized equipment. The result was a massive improvement in productivity, and the approach enabled the volume production needed to meet those demands of that growing mass market. Significantly, Wedgwood also recognized the need to manage the major changes this would bring to working lives, not least the elimination of the old apprentice and journeyman system that he'd grown up with. In 1769, he opened a new factory complex named Etruria, in a nod to those ancient Etruscans whose civilization had inspired many of his best-selling designs. It was a planned community, designed to house workshops, showrooms, and his workers and their families, a far cry from the old cottage industry in which he'd grown up. It gave him practical advantages such as co-location of key activities, which reduced time and transportation costs, but it also was an early attempt to create a different kind of working environment. He passed on some of the significant benefits that higher productivity at the factory gave by paying higher wages, and he experimented with ways of improving the working environment, providing clothing, washing facilities, even an early form of air conditioning. Etruria was strategically located next to the newly constructed Trent and Mersey Canal, a venture which he'd campaigned hard for, and which was to help significantly in managing the wider logistics and distribution challenges of his business. These weren't small. In the mid-1700s, the pottery industry was sourcing its clays and other material from the southwest, down in Devon and Dorset, which meant shipping them north to ports like Liverpool or Chester, and then transporting them slowly along an antiquated road system down to Staffordshire. Wedgwood's efforts to promote better roads, and particularly the cutting of this 94-mile canal linking Liverpool with the potteries, paid off. Despite having a long planning battle with Parliament, the canal was finally opened in 1777, and with it came the chance to reduce inbound logistics cost and open up better distribution to his increasingly global market. Now, growing a business often carries with it the risk that cash flow gets out of balance. This wasn't the case with Wedgwood. His early family history had given him an abiding sense of the need to control costs, once complaining that his sales were at an all-time high and yet his profits were minimal. So he carefully studied cost structures and came to value economics of scale, trying to avoid producing one-off vases, at least until we had got into a more methodical way of making the same sorts over again. And as we've seen, he brought a scientific approach to his work, carefully recording the results of his experiments to build a clearer understanding of how to move manufacturing from a haphazard trial and error process to one which allowed for reproducible control. In 1783, he was awarded a patent for a pyrometer designed to measure the extreme temperatures within a kiln, which helped tame the chaotic and unpredictable firing process. And for this and other achievements, he was recognized by being elected a Fellow of the Royal Society, joining his scientific friends and colleagues like Joseph Priestley and Matthew Boulton. Although this was named as his key achievement, the award really testifies to over 30 years of systematic research and development. But Wedgwood wasn't one to rest on his laurels. In 1774, he built on his success with creamware and his factory changes with another major innovation: jasperware. This was a new material, laboriously developed to offer a new approach to pottery making. And it led to a material that was unglazed and had a distinctive matte, a biscuit finish. He experimented with many different colours, including green, lilac, yellow, black and white. In fact, the Victoria and Albert Museum in London has still got several display trays showing the many different samples. But the distinctive light blue colour which caught the imagination and which survives to this day in thousands of artists' palettes and in children's colouring books was Wedgwood blue. Now, jasperware's development built on Bentley's observation of that growing interest in ancient cultural artefacts from Greek, Roman and Etruscan civilizations. Wealthier people had begun undertaking the grand tour of Europe and bringing back souvenirs such as Roman cameos. Jasperware provided the perfect medium for making such products available in England. Pieces would be ornamented with scenes and reliefs, not simply painted on, but applied as a separate layer of clay before firing. It gave Wedgwood products a distinctive trademark to further bolster their brand. Now, in keeping with Wedgwood's philosophy, the jasperware product and process continuously evolved. For example, early specimens used cobalt to colour the entire body, mixing it in with the clay. But this was extremely expensive, and so a later development used a dipping process in which a thin layer of coloured slip, that's a kind of watery clay, was applied just before firing. Now, this continuous improvement of the jasperware concept led to perhaps Wedgwood's last and what he considered his great work, the 5-year journey towards creating a replica of the ancient Roman Portland vase. The original was a masterpiece of cameo glass from the 1st century BC and has always been considered one of the greatest works of antiquity. No one knew how it had been made. The secret of its creation had been lost for over 1700 years. Wedgwood's attempt to recreate that was less a commercial venture, though once again it did bring powerful reputational benefits, but instead he saw it as the ultimate challenge of his technical skills. To achieve this, he conducted thousands of experiments over those 5 years to perfect the blue-black colour and the delicate low-relief figures in jasperware. He relied on the pyrometer he'd invented to control the firing and worked with renowned sculptor John Flaxman to create those intricate white reliefs. The project had many challenges, including the fact that very often it would blister and crack at a late stage. But his persistence paid off. The first successful copies of that vase were released in 1790. They proved to be so accurate that when the original was accidentally shattered at the British Museum, Wedgwood's jasperware copy was used to help piece it back together. Now, Wedgwood's health had never been great. He'd finally had that leg amputated in 1768. By 1770, his sight was beginning to fail him. When Bentley died in 1780, Wedgwood stepped back from the marketing side and focused his remaining attention on the factory and his laboratory. But in 1794, he fell ill again and died, aged 64, in 1795. Was it worth it? He'd started by inheriting £20 from his father. When he died, he left one of the biggest industrial concerns in England, and his personal fortune was around £500,000 in those days. That's around 50 million today. When he began the business, the big names in Staffordshire pottery were those of manufacturers like Josiah Wedgwood and Thomas Minton. It didn't take long before the name of Wedgwood and Bentley was up there with them, their company arguably the best-known pottery in the world. And in building it, he helped create an industry which continues to produce beautiful artifacts for widespread use around the world. And one which has grown in value. The ceramic tableware market size was worth around $12.5 billion in 2024, and it's forecast to reach $22 billion over the next 10 years. He left his business to his sons, who continued through several generations to maintain the company's reputation for quality and innovation. It remained an independent company until the 20th century, where in 1987 it was merged with several other businesses, and in 2015 it was acquired by a Finnish company who have retained the brand and still produce prestige wares such as hand-painted and limited edition objects. And jasperware is still made by a small team of skilled workers in the UK. So in a sense, Josiah Wedgwood's business is still vase making to the universe.